Well, a very good evening and welcome to this special ThinkIn on the state and indeed the future of British democracy. I'm Matt D'Ancona, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm really delighted that this event, which was going to be physically in Bristol as part of our Democracy Roadshow, has survived in digital form. And I hope you're all keeping safe and as cool as is feasible in this extraordinary and frankly rather alarming heat wave. To which I'm sure we will talk about in the next hour. A word about the democracy project of which this ThinkIn is part. Back in 2019, especially when Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament was found by the Supreme Court to be unlawful, we at Tortoise began to feel that there was a greater problem with the rules that govern our political system and our democracy. And initially, we started to look at the potential of a codified constitution. And we're still interested in that idea, but the inquiry even then fast broadened into a more general series of questions, I guess, about the system as a whole. Why was trust in such steep decline? Why people felt let down by politics and insufficiently heeded when it came to the provision of decent, fair, responsive public services? And then what role would digital technology play in all of this, and what problems and solutions might offer? And then, of course, our reporting was halted by the pandemic in the spring of 2020, but I'm delighted to say that it's now fully resumed, both in our audio journalism, our SenseMaker family, and in events around the country. We had a special democracy summit earlier this month in our newsroom, and it's really very much at the heart of what Tortoise is doing. So that's enough for me. I want to really kick off as soon as I can with the fantastic group of speakers we have. Dr. Kerry Davis, who's the director of the Centre for Deliberative Research at NatCen, whose research is focused on the public's voice in deliberative processes and upon ways of enhancing its power. Councillor Tim Y, who is the Green Card Party councillor for Ashley Ward in Bristol, former head of adult social care, drugs and homelessness commissioning in Bristol City Council, and still deeply involved in residential care and a whole smorgasbord of social policy issues. And then the brilliant Louise Tickell, whose journalism, masterly as it is, will be familiar to Tortoise members and readers. She's a mantelpiece full of awards, and her Tortoise investigation, Hidden Homicides, I'm delighted to say, was nominated for the Orwell Prize for exposing Britain's social evils this year. At the helm of the chat today is my colleague James Wilson, so please do chip in with any thoughts, ideas, whims or proposals you may have. This is the purpose of the exercise. So let me dive in, if I may, with Kerry. Kerry, thanks very much for joining us. I suppose I want to scroll back a little bit, talk about your research generally. And the pandemic was a period when public consultations, and indeed most forms of consultation and gathering, had to shift from in-person to digital. And I know you carried out quite a lot of research during the pandemic on that. What lessons did you draw about the scope of digital technology to enhance and consultation with members of the public, but also the problems associated with it?
Yes, I think so. The purpose of the research that I do, as you said in the introduction, is really looking at ways in which citizens can be more engaged with policy making, with decision making, in the context of democracy more broadly. And definitely, as you say, one of the things which we encountered, as did many other research organisations and anybody actually trying to work accessing kind of community and public voice during the pandemic, were two main things, I think. One was certainly social distancing and the impact that had on all of the ways in which we were used to working with people and hearing from people, but also that people themselves were going through an unprecedented public health crisis, which was impacting their lives in a variety of different ways, which put the priority of what they were experiencing and the sort of health picture in relief to a range of other kind of policy issues of the time. So for example, we were doing some work for DEFRA, exploring people's perspectives and attitudes on the environment and trying to think about the ways in which DEFRA's plans around their 25-year environmental plan might be better implemented with public support. And the learning that we took from having to essentially redesign how we were going to actually access and talk to people. I think the learning from that and a range of other projects was principally that the shift to using more digital means perhaps wasn't as exploited fully as it might have been. I think I can't speak for the research community. One of the things we encountered was actually video conferencing, and the rise of Zoom, as we're using now to host kind of virtual gatherings, became a really important part of maintaining research of this type, and convening groups of people together in order to share their views and perspectives, but at the same time acknowledging that, you know, we live in an environment in the UK where the digital divide is quite real, and people's ability to access technology and therefore their ability to still engage with the consultation and debate that might have been on offer would have been limited. So defaulting to a kind of digital means as we are now was certainly very useful, and I think enabled us to engage and maintain the exploration of public attitudes in a consistent way. At the same time, I think there was less creativity, or what we've seen since then is greater creativity in the different ways in which that can happen. So not just relying on people having a good internet connection essentially in order to be part of kind of critical conversations. So the implications for that, certainly again from a sort of more democratic point of view, is you know, what are the range of ways in which it might be important to provide different fora, both for access, but also what kind of structures might you need at more local levels in order to give people the right support, the right convening power, and the sort of right capacity to actually continue having important conversations about the things that matter to them.
I know you mentioned the project you did on citizen engagement on the environment, which I believe was published about a year ago.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And I mean, it would be idle of me not to ask, given, you know, what's going on right now, what level of engagement you found, and whether it was divided into silos, themes. Did people have a kind of holistic idea on the climate emergency and how it should be addressed, or was it quite difficult to aggregate those ideas?
I think it was a bit of a mixture. So I do think that one of the things that research found is that people probably had a greater appetite than we might have anticipated for engaging on environmental issues, and not just in relation to climate, but more broadly. And I think certainly from a policymaker perspective, that was an interesting thing for them to hear. I think there are some assumptions sometimes that some aspects of the environment are too technical or might not be interesting enough, or are suitably complex, that there might be a running assumption that there's some parts of the population that simply wouldn't find that interesting enough, or be motivated enough to engage in it. And I think that the research certainly demonstrated that you could give people the opportunity and the conditions to have a voice in the things that they experience every day, that they're more likely to kind of connect with you on that. I think that one of the things that we did find, and as I say, the research towards the end of the research, it also intersected with the pandemic, is that there were groups of people who found it easier to think more holistically about the environment as a complex system and how it interrelated both in the UK but also on a global scale. And then there were some people for whom, when you asked them to think about potential trade-offs or priorities between what should be looked after and in what ways, it was in terms of where government might spend its money, for example, it was more common for people to default to needing the UK to have, you know, kind of investment and retaining kind of funds and policy focus for the UK, even though we know that many of our problems, many of the issues and opportunities with the environment are interlinked globally, and certainly with international agreements and other aspects of how the environment impacts globally. So I think there was a bit of a mixture between both of those things, but as I say, certainly kind of public appetite to have the conversation was high, and I think it also indicated that there might be something around needing to build the picture for people and give them concrete understandings and scenarios about what different environmental futures might look like for us in the UK as well as internationally, to enable people to kind of pick through that in a way that they feel kind of committed to and can give, you know, informed attitudes on.
I was rudely kicked out of the room, and I muted myself. Just going back to digital exclusion, Kerry, I mean, what's the extent of that, do you think, still? Because my suspicion, being at some of these digital ThinkIns, has been that, and indeed more generally, you know, on the road, is that it's a greater problem than we perhaps generally acknowledge in elite politics, if I might call it that.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I don't think I disagree. We started a project in 2019, actually, so pre-pandemic, and what we were gathering people's perspectives on what they thought should be happening in key areas of policy making once we'd left the European Union. And the plan with that project was to run the deliberations online and then run the deliberations face to face and see if we could learn anything about the differences in people's experience and access to technology. Then the pandemic hit and we ended up running both events online in consecutive years. And I think that, as you say, sort of pre-pandemic, there was a sense, perhaps, I can't speak to kind of digital access, but certainly levels of digital literacy were perhaps lower. And I think that there has been some increase in some groups with that over the course of the pandemic and where we find ourselves now. But I think that you're right. I think there's an assumption as well, as I was saying before, that sort of digital exclusion acts only on whether you've got broadband or not, or whether you've got reliable broadband or whether you've got access to a device. But I think it speaks to many other related issues around kind of economics, around income, around capability, around support, and local networks and relationships. And I think all of those things start to feed into the notion of digital exclusion rather than it just be a technology question.
Thanks very much, Kerry. We will surely come back to you. Can I move to Tim? Tim, we were going to be in your neighbourhood for this. We're now in cyberspace, but delighted that you can bring some Bristol wisdom to this discussion. We're in the middle of a heat wave, and you know, I'm fascinated in the way in which, just to take your community, perhaps even your ward or Bristol more generally, how it's dealt with a series of public emergencies in the last 2.5 years, and how well do the structures of local democracy cope with those sort of headwinds?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, we've obviously had a major kind of debate about local democracy in Bristol here with the referendum about the mayor, which is a classic one. The most frustrating thing about that was we only got something like 26% turnout for something that is quite important in terms of the way the city runs. That actually caused a big debate about what local democracy was around in Bristol. So there's some people arguing that it's democratic to have one figurehead that everyone can identify with, but the system also lends itself to a system whereby nobody else gets a voice in the system. So in Bristol, we've got 24 Green councillors, 24 Labour, so we're equal on that, and then 11 Conservative and 8 Lib Dems. Don't quote me on the exact number of those. And we have no influence at all in the direction of policy of the city, which is really frustrating. So but democracy, different people say that the mayor is the most democratic kind of system. So that's been interesting. We're obviously going to be moving into a committee system. Some of the worries around that are about it creates it's much as speedy in terms of decision making, but I'm not sure I've seen the mayor system really particularly delivering system change.
It's interesting you say that, because in this whole debate about the broken system, democracy, how to enrich it, there are certain ideas which have a season, and metro mayors have certainly had a season, and the idea that mayoralties generally are a inevitable good was for a while unchallenged. But it's fascinating what you just said, actually, which is that there is a very strong counter argument to that.
They're very, very strong indeed. And it comes to, I mean, you know, unashamedly from the Green Party, so we support PR in some shape or form. We're not too fussed about which way it comes, but we believe that decisions are best made by trying to incorporate all different sorts of views. Otherwise, it's whoever it is a one-party system of who decides what. So absolutely. I mean, you know, as a party, we voted, you know, to have the committee system. I actually abstained on that because I think we hadn't. My really problem with it is when I knocked on the doorstep around the mayor, people just said, what's this? We have no idea what this is about. So what I was trying to advocate was to actually that we should have the vote on the mayor in a year's time and actually really engage citizens with what that actually means and should the governance of the city look like. But that didn't come to anything. But that was severely missing from the debate and really noticeable, which accounted for the quite low turnout, to be honest. So that was a missed opportunity for Bristol, I think.
But just looking at it, as a councillor, what are the things? And we've been through this extraordinary period of prolonged public health emergency and now a heat wave. What are the improvements in local democracy and indeed in the joined up writing, if you like, between democratic structures and public service provision that need to be made to help build resilience in these situations?
Well, the one that I think is most crucial is if you look at Bristol Airport. So our colleagues in North Somerset voted very clearly with a lot of public support around not expanding Bristol Airport. That's now been overturned. I mean, the story is not over, but for the moment, that's been overturned through rather archaic planning laws, which means that you can't take into account the global impact on a local planning decision. So I think the sort of frustrations in local government is some of the sort of legislation around it that actually fetters your discretions to make decisions on behalf of local people, basically. So I'm just reading the chat that's coming up about that, but I'll try not to do that because it's probably not helpful. So that's one certainly thing. We need to get any sort of legislation updated and we need to devolve that decision making back to local people and local councils.
What you've just described, I mean, it's very interesting on the airport, is a system that is not only confused but also massively outdated, because the notion that you can't include the global impact of a decision like that is obviously late 20th century at best.
Yes.
And so I mean which leads to the next question I was going to ask you, which is, the green message obviously has a purchase, and the Green Party has made advances, but shelving for a moment the question of electoral reform, which is obviously the heart and centre of what you want, and there is a strong case for it. Do you feel that where are we, in the summer of 2022, in the Green Party's message being heard more generally in the public square, both at local and national level?
Do you mean the environmental message?
Yes, I mean small g, but also cap G. Yeah,
I think that both are beginning to get purchased. If you ask me, I think that we're at a stage where people get the environmental crisis and the looming disaster we're all facing. They get it on a logical level, but they don't necessarily quite get it on an emotional level. So for example, we were chatting just before everyone joined us about how the Ukraine cost of living crisis, things like that, just push the environment off the agenda. Whereas if you listen to Brian Cox being interviewed the other week, he was saying, no, these things, the environmental disaster we're facing is just so imminent that we can't stop doing it. And that message is starting to get purchased, and it's also starting to get purchased outside the kind of traditional support. So out of our 24 Green councillors in Bristol that got elected last year, one's from the Sudanese community, one's from the Somali communities, one from the Afro-Caribbean communities. And it has traditionally been a bit more of a kind of white middle class kind of movement. So that message is also getting out of that group into a wider, who can see, and some of them can see the link up with, countries that are far more challenged than ourselves at the moment with the climate crisis. So I think we're nearly there. We've got it emotionally, not intellectually, but we are spreading the message out. And I think that's a sort of small g, and that's a whole number of people from XR to Greenpeace or whoever pushing that message. It's not just the Green Party. I think the Green Party big G is getting a little bit more purchase now, just because people see it as an alternative to some of the traditional parties. So PR is a big selling point for us. That's absolutely one that people kind of think is the logical the way forward. I mean, the system is clearly broken. I did some research on this, and I looked at the Electoral Reform, and one of their directors, William Sullivan, said when it takes 900,000 votes to elect one party's MP, Caroline Lucas, and just 26,000 for another, you know the system is not just struggling, it's bankrupt. And I think people are largely seeing that as well. And they don't like the one-party slate, which is why Bristol did, I think, one of the many reasons that Bristol voted against having the mayor position. So I think that sort of that green message of electoral reform is clearly making through. What else goes down well on the doorstep is when we talk to people about how, for example, we're not a whipped party, which people get really surprised at, but we actually are in a position where we can, represent our residents' views or and not necessarily toe the party line on that. Clearly, I think there'd be a problem if somebody's a climate change denier, so there are limits to it. But I think people are looking for more discussive politics than has been traditional, and I think that's playing well for us.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Tim. We'll obviously come back to you. Louise, can I turn to you? And I mean, I know that the Bristol area is one you know very well, but I'm also interested in your thoughts about the democracy issue more generally on a national level as well as a local one, and specifically, you've done tremendous work on the criminal justice system, the family justice system, and it seems to me that the extent to which they are broken is a very important part of this. In other words, there's an old-fashioned way of looking at democratic renewal, which is purely to do with the institutions that exist in one postcode in London. But actually, there's a lot more to it than that, isn't there?
As a reporter, I've never looked particularly at systems of government. What I look at, I think, is the threads that create and support the democracy that government organises. So I look at how we organise and how we hold accountable the institutions across society. I look at the integrity that they operate with, the level of consent that they can draw on, and how weak or strong they are, because they've been built over centuries, decades and centuries, and we depend on them. Our democracy depends on them. So all of those threads are part of our democracy, and they're what underpin and uphold it. So yeah, I've done a lot looking very specifically at family justice and at criminal justice in terms of the way that it deals with domestic abuse and femicide in particular. And what you see if you report on those things over years, and I've been reporting on the family justice system for approaching 8 years now, and domestic abuse for well over a decade, is that you see that those threads are getting weaker. I mean, it literally feels to me like a piece of fabric that has been rubbed through in so many places. And that comes with just enormous costs. And because society doesn't work just by people having particular jobs and people being paid and only doing those jobs, important work is often bolstered, underpinned, strengthened by the vocations of the people who work in those roles, who work undoubtedly in the police, who work in local councils, who work in domestic abuse services, who work in the CPS, who, they do not work to rule. They do way more than they are paid for. But when the system becomes very much dependent on people doing work they're not paid for and refuses to pay them for valuable work they do, then you end up in a really difficult, dangerous place. So, we know that in the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, there has been a massive outflow and loss of expertise as the number of jobs has been cut. So while there is enormous criticism, rightly, of both those services, they are not supported to do the jobs that we would all wish them to be able to do. And we have a situation where rape has effectively been decriminalised. Domestic abuse, which I'll just turn my phone off. Domestic abuse, which I really do now think is so widespread throughout society that it is the scourge of our time, and which the government itself estimated cost £66 billion per year in 2017 alone, is effectively, it's something that people can do in their relationships with impunity, although the government desperately tries to add on bits of legislation here and there, which is welcome and which is valuable. But if all the other underpinning parts of society that put people under enormous pressures and mean that you can't escape, and so your choices are limited because there is no houses and there is no refuge and there are no support services for your children, and it's difficult to move school places, then what happens eventually is that all the little threads that might have caught a person have simply disappeared. You know, this goes on to children's services, and I live in Gloucestershire, and a few years ago its children's services were in an absolutely dire state. They're still not great, and I recently reported on terrible failings in children's services in Herefordshire Council for Panorama. And what you hear when you listen to social workers who work within those children's services departments is, although bad things are undoubtedly happening, there is a £2.2 billion shortfall, directors of children's services say, in being able to offer the kinds of services to family that allow them to protect their children and to keep them safe. And so what you end up with is a local council with statutory responsibilities for children's services, which have no money to provide support services, so that what happens in the end is that families end up in child protection crisis, and then you end up in the family courts, you may end up in the criminal courts, and the cost is enormous. And these are the things that I think are really interesting about how democracy starts to unfurl and unpick itself, because then if you don't have a criminal justice system that you can trust, if you can't trust your government to help support you keep your children safe and fed and educated, if you can't believe that the police will investigate properly and that the CPS will charge in a timely way and that the criminal justice service will hear your case in a timescale that's in any sense meaningful, then consent starts to disappear. And in a democracy, when consent starts to disappear, then I think you're in a really dangerous place, because people begin to question the contract between themselves and government.
I mean, it's fascinating listening to you, Louise, because it's one of the things in your work I always find is that, of course, resources are hugely important. And, you know, if there is now to be another wave of austerity to fund tax cuts, you know, God help us all. One can only hope not. But there's also a lot of attention in your journalism to culture, the culture of institutions, the culture of services, and in particular, a sort of reflex to withhold information. And I find this fascinating because we live in an era where in principle and in rhetoric, there has never been more information available than before. But in practice, as you've shown, actually, when it comes to the information that can need to inform citizenship, it's a different story, isn't it?
Oh, the idea that information is freely available is one that journalists just dream of. You know, I spend a lot of my time wrestling information out of public authorities by means of FOI requests, which are, you know, only rarely fully answered. You then have to appeal, you then have to protest, you have to evidence your reasons, you have to re-ask the question in a different format that's more acceptable. The withholding of information, which all institutions do, and that doesn't matter whether they are privately owned companies or whether they are government institutions, but I find it particularly perfidious when it's government, because that is our information. And the reasons that they give for withholding are often simply not good enough. It is the deepest frustration, and I think it comes from such a number of places. It comes from fear of criticism. It comes from people's fear, ultimately, of losing their jobs and reputation. And that fear just becomes, and self-protection within institutions, and I'm thinking particularly of local government, particularly of police, and also, in fact, the family justice system, with whom I sort of battle on a kind of weekly basis, it feels like the culture of secrecy ultimately hurts everybody. Because if we don't have accurate information about what is going on in really life-changing services, then how do they ever improve? I don't know what the answer is. You know, Tony Blair brought in, I think it was kind of reluctantly in the end, the idea of being able to make a freedom of information request. But that's a very blunt tool.
Yes, and he said in his memoirs that it was his greatest error.
Oh, really? Did he?
There's a lengthy section in one of the chapters about what an idiot he was, and he regrets it quite openly and publicly, which is instructive in itself.
It is, isn't it? I mean, freedom of information requests are extremely useful, but they are limited by the willingness of organisations to understand the import of what you're asking for. But in the family justice system, there is a deep culture of suspicion of the media and of any request for openness, which is starting to be kind of jemmied open, but it is so painful. And yet the decisions that are made within the family justice system to remove children from parents, to restrict parents from seeing children, to require parents to make available their children for contact to somebody who has been proven to be domestically abusive, for instance, are so life-changing that it feels to me obvious that as much information as safely can be made available should be made available, but that is an argument that is still being fought.
You hinted at it earlier, Louise. It seems to me that one of the problems with this kind of difficulty is that it breeds a general cynicism about the possibility of improvement, and that kind of very of the very sort of traditional faith in evidence policy-based solutions still exists, but is beginning to corrode very badly. And I'm intrigued in when you're talking to people in these very extreme and intense situations, do you notice a kind of cynicism, a decline in faith and apathy, and or an optimism, at least a germ of an optimism?
When you're talking to a family, as I did last week at Tortoise, in fact, I just took a call from a woman whose daughter had been murdered in the most horrific circumstances. And she told me, she wanted to tell me how it had been done, because she said, most people cannot listen to this. And those families, what they are desperate for is for institutions to learn. Everything else is lost to them. And, you know, the children that they are looking after who have been bereaved of their mothers, their lives have been changed forever. So whenever a family in that situation is seeking change, they're doing it for others, but they face such pushback in all their efforts, perhaps because they are the family. I feel they are seen as less credible because, of course, this is an emotional thing for them, but they also often become extremely expert in the area in which they're campaigning. And for some, the pushback and the pain becomes way too much, and only a very few, for whatever reason it is, are able to keep going. So yeah, there is enormous cynicism from people who complain of sexual assault and find that their complaints are taken no further, to the extent that so many people now would not wish to report because of the way they are treated. Not necessarily that they're treated badly by police, they might be, but perhaps because of the way they're treated by the criminal justice system, that they're told a trial will take place at a certain point, they G themselves up to go to that trial, then it's called off at the very last minute, there's very little support. Eventually witnesses drop away and you stand no chance of a criminal conviction. And in the end, ultimately, so many people are not doing that for themselves. They're doing that to protect other people from future sexual assaults from that perpetrator. And so I think the cynicism that grows when the democratic threads of that fabric that we have worked so hard to build, and so many people have worked so hard to build before us, as that becomes more threadbare, society does become more cynical, and it becomes increasingly difficult for the kind of journalism I do to have the effect that obviously I want it to make policymakers think, to make people feel that they have a way of getting their voices heard, because they feel that there is no point to that.
Yeah, so it's very, very sobering. Thank you, Louise. Can I come to Andrew Girdwood, if possible? Andrew, you there?
I am. Hi.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you as ever. Andrew, you had a number of reflections in the chat, and rather than me try and paraphrase them, why don't you let us know what you're thinking on all this?
Well, the most latest one, I was inspired by just how responsible Louise had been with her reporting, and I was contrasting that to the damage I think the Murdoch media empire has done to public confidence in the political process, or the lack of it, especially around Europe. And I suppose that's negative, but there is a positive, I think, because unlike the mention of PR from the Green Party, there is the public relations part of politics that maybe we can put a PR spin on politics as a whole and try and gain some public support for politics again. I don't know. And as it happens, I do think proportional representation might help get people more engaged, because your vote will be more meaningful. Here in Scotland, we have sort of weird systems of PR, and actually it's quite useful. I've seen more, sort of anecdotally, more discussion on Facebook about who you're going to vote for your second vote, because it's meaningful, and I think that conversation has helped.
What about you? I mean, I know you know a lot about the digital piece, and I'm interested in what you think. What role technology has in enabling or blocking access?
So I have to be a bit careful here, because I do work in that sphere. But certainly my experience in Scotland is, if you are working on a digital project for a well-run Scottish government campaign, you have to leap through significant burning hoops to prove that you have been mindful of digital inclusion. And this is not just does somebody with broadband, can they use this? It's, does this work on all devices? Does this work on slow devices? If somebody has some restrictions to their movement or their eyesight, will they be able to find what's going on? And yes, it's a pain, but more of this sort of thing. It's a good sort of pain. I was having a debate this morning about the damage of out-of-home advertising devices do to the environment. One of these big digital billboards that you drive by that are on all the time, I mean, they're like 56 houses worth of energy burning. It's an incredible amount of money. But if the council gets that money, it can go to really useful things. So I'm toying with the idea of saying, well, it's not my decision, but in my head, wouldn't that be great if money like that went to digital inclusion or digital green fight, just ring fence that money. So you're damaging the environment, therefore you've got to spend it on good things. So maybe digital inclusion can eat itself. As digital rolls out, we can give tablets to people, and that's all it takes. 5G will take broadband away as a problem.
Thanks ever so much, as ever, Andrew. Can we go to Zebedee, who I think is in the house today? Zebedee, you there?
Hello there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
Just interested in you were obviously, you had views on the whole question of access to information.
Oh yes, I was just picking up the point that Louise was saying about how institutions tend to, as a matter of course, withhold information when, there's probably, in most cases, a need and a right to have that information. And they often use, in my experience, individuals' privacy rights as the reason for not providing that information. But as I was saying, recently in that Foreign Office ex-permanent secretary's intervention, when he talked about Chris Pincher having had a previous case and so on, there, he found it the right thing to do, and it was the right thing to do to come out with that information, even though it probably transgressed Chris Pincher's rights. But in his own official role as permanent secretary, I doubt whether he would have done that while he was in office, you know, in other sort of contexts and other sort of cases. But also, Matthew, I wanted to say that, you know, in these cases where you ask us to say in our own words what it is that we think, I don't think that's necessary, because I mean, I feel that you can actually sort of say these things much better than many of us.
Well, that's very flattering, but I have to tell you that the whole point and purpose of tortoise in this respect is to go around like magpies, change the species, and pick up great ideas from people like yourself. So that really is how it works. But it's very kind of you to say that.
Okay, great.
William Jeremy, I see, is here, and it's good to see you, William. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine, Matt. Can you hear me?
I can, and it's great to see and hear from you, William. What are your views on? You've been pitching in on electoral reform.
Yes, I'm just wondering about the current case for electoral reform generally, and specifically, I remember being a parliamentary candidate, no less, for the Lib Dems back in the early 2000s, down in Carmarthen West and South Pembs. They split the Pembrokeshire constituency between Welsh-speaking Carmarthen and Little England beyond Wales. And I suppose I've been involved with the Lib Dems for a while, post growing up with the SDP. And there are all these pamphlets on electoral reform and how absolutely awful first past the post was. And the very notion of the phrase electoral reform means, you know, the system needs reform as an intro to the argument. But what's been troubling me a bit in the last few years is how we keep the constituency link, which clearly are indirect, parliamentary form of indirect democracy likes to uphold, along with the other wider institutions that Louise was talking about, the rule of law, particularly the court system, and of course the free press as well. I'm just wondering whether the proportionality element of electoral reform might erode the idea that there's one person elected to represent the interests. And I'm just thinking perhaps we need to widen the thinking around that as part of some of the reforms that we are thinking about. Does any of that make sense? Or
it does indeed, and of course there are species of electoral reform and that preserve the constituency link, but also have a proportional dimension too, and one can spend the whole day talking about it. William, thank you. I'd like to go back to Kerry, if I may, because I'm very interested in trying to knit together some things that Louise was talking about, Kerry. And you know, your kind of deep knowledge of public voice and Louise's sort of journalism on the sense the public have they don't have a voice, and how one can kind of marry the two together. You know, what are the, I mean, in terms of actual hard policy, what are the things that could be done at a local or even at a national level to start to really put an engine, you know, put the rocket boosters under some of the structures you were discussing earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that comes to mind immediately is conversations that I hear a lot, which are around the sort of institutionalization of a more discursive politics, basically, or, you know, forms of democracy which are more deliberative in their means and in their design. And that's obviously where the world that my research sits in. And that would knit together a series of things that people have mentioned already. Obviously, I'm biased. I think it's the way to go. But it might hold together a series of things which are currently quite disaggregated. And I was really taken by the idea that in the way in which people, Louise was talking about the sort of the fabric of some of the institutions being rubbed thin. Obviously, the contract between governments and citizens is similar. So I think that sort of forms of politics or are working into our current system. So of course there's kind of revolution, but there's also what can you do in the meantime, that I think more kind of actively and regularly institutionalizes public voice through deliberative means would be one of the things that it would be worth pushing for, and that could easily be, well, I say easily, listen to me. I think there is an opportunity to think about where policy making and the work of government in particular starts to incorporate that on a more regularized basis. So the types of projects that I get involved in do that on a, are intended to do that, but they end up being on particular topics and, at the will of policymakers who are sort of ready to design in and understand how the way in which public voice could be kind of convened and incorporated into policy making worlds. They're sort of open to that. I think the two particular things I wanted to pick on in relation to that are that deliberation relies somewhat on being informed. So the theoretical idea behind it is that you're listening to the views of an informed public. And so there's a lot for me about what people have raised so far this evening around information and the role of access to information and the kind of culture of information that exists between institutions and citizens, but also more broadly in the various ways in which we take in, the facts and experiences of our world. And I think there's something implied in deliberation which suggests that everybody has sort of access to the same sets of information, that somehow we can come to some sort of shared understanding on policy propositions or the things that we're trying to tackle. And that to me seems like a key and important part of trying to have meaningful conversations between citizens and institutions, if that's the binary we can work within. A second thing which relates to that is this idea that then information or becoming informed can be something that can only be rational. So again, as Louise was saying, somebody wanted to tell the story of their horrific experience, which isn't able to be articulated or understood or listened to from an institutional lens, because it relies very much more on that sort of rational notion of expertise. Again, there's room in deliberation, I think, to incorporate a wider view of how we understand and articulate our lives and how that might be heard and responded to by policymakers and decision makers. And thirdly, I think that, as I say, a lot of the conversations I'm party to, there's been some great work actually done by the OECD about institutionalizing deliberative democracy. They did this big report called Catching the Deliberative Wave, which drew together over 600 examples from the UK and other countries across the globe about the ways in which these processes have been used in different governmental setups. And one of the things that I have been talking about, an idea, a thought proposal, which is on the table, which is not mine, but that I work with others, is around this idea of bringing together a sort of citizens' convention on UK democracy. What are the ways in which you could think about structuring in a mixture of formal, in-person, and using digital means in order to do a bit more of what Tim was talking about in terms of the opportunity for people to know what it is that they're discussing or being asked to decide on, as well as together coming up with sort of principles and ideas around the ways in which that could work or be enacted in more institutionalized contexts. So I hope that made broad sense. In my mind, these things are connected.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Kerry. I think Gray Andrews has his hand up. If we can come to Gray. Gray, hi, how are you?
Hi, warm. Scrap the whip. Winning the party system will help out winning Parliament. In fact, I'm not very keen on the parliamentary system per se, where you've got parties rather than individuals to vote for. I get slated for this time after time after time. We need to bring political savvy into schools. We need to teach it, not necessarily as a testable subject, but 2 years after somebody leaves school, they could be voting in an election. They haven't got a clue. I haven't voted in my entire life. I'm 68. And that's because I had a very, very politically engaged uncle that sat down and told me how the system worked, first past the post, etc., 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 and say, we don't have democracy in this country, Graham. And we don't. We don't have it in work. We don't really have it out in the streets because people above us, we get a government of 43%. voted in 43%, I think it was what Johnson got, with an absolutely massive working majority. 57% of people don't support that. So somehow we need a checks and balances thing within, even if we use the first past the post system, we need a checks and balances thing in the Houses of Parliament where, say, if 43% of the opposition MPs voted, they have like 1.1, 1.2 votes per, and it would block the government. And if they wanted to really stop legislation and got 50% of the vote, okay, proportionally they would have less, maybe 1.01 vote each. So, I mean, we've got no checks and balances in the system. The winner takes all is not democratic.
Would you like to see a sort of American-style separation of powers with a codified constitution?
Similar, very similar, yeah. I mean, we've needed this for years, to be quite honest. I went back to college at, what was I, 49. So that's nearly 20 years ago. And I got into the theoretical side of politics far much more at university than I ever did otherwise. But I can't engage normal people, ordinary people, in political conversations. So deliberative democracy, which is one of the things I am in favor of, especially at the local level, can't take place. I'm not impressed by the representatives either in Parliament or at the local level, just because they don't have the knowledge. They don't seem to have the insight. They're very good public speakers. They're very good at placating people and telling people what they want to hear, but they're not very good at getting things done.
It's very interesting. Something we hear time and again in these ThinkIns is, and indeed we did a very big poll earlier in the year of 4,000 people, and the lack of faith in representative democracy and MPs is very much at the heart of all this, I think. Tim, I think you wanted to come back in on a few points.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just a couple of people mentioned PR. I think one point you picked up, Matthew, is we can easily sort out a system that has some kind of constituency representation, so that's not a problem. When I'm campaigning, going around the doorstep, you just get people in my ward, like if you're a Conservative, there's literally no point in you walking down to the polling station. 25 million people in this country live in safe seats, it's estimated. So, and for them, it's entirely pointless voting. And so they're completely disenfranchised from the system. I think the other thing about representative politics, I think we need to think about how we decentralize things back to local authorities and give us some real powers, which we've lost over the years. I mean, we've got a decent Labour MP here, but she gets involved in graffiti and clear up. She shouldn't be. That should be down to local authorities. So I think decentralization is a key thing to address that question, and we have to bring in some kind of PR to get people to actually engage back in politics. Can I just take issue with Gary just briefly as well about young people? We've got one of our councillors, Lily Fitzgibbon, was 19 when she got elected. She brought Greta Thunberg over here for the youth strikes. She's very engaged in politics. I know a lot of young people around teenagers that are very engaged. By the time they're 20, they've sort of given up, to be honest. So, I've just challenged that back a bit. And finally, my personal thing that I would love to see as a halfway house, I think we should be trying to work out a way, even in our first past the post, of actually making that vote count. So why don't we have a second chamber, the House of Lords, that's elected proportionally on the basis of what you vote for your first past the post party, just to get us thinking about how PR might actually work in the future. So that one more point. Sorry, Matthew. I think the tide is changing. I was at the Toll Puddle Martyrs Festival this weekend. Not a group of people that are particularly into PR traditionally, but a lot of people were saying to me, "Yeah, actually, PR has got some mileage." So I think it's gaining support there as well. Right, I'll shut up now.
No, it's all good stuff. Thank you, Tim. Louise, you had some closing thoughts, I think.
I do. Now I've unmuted myself. Thank you. Just picking up on what people have said about young people, I am so discouraged by the way that they are. Well, I have two children aged 14 and 11, and the way that schools operate in this country. I was brought up in Brussels, and I I don't know if it was entirely different there, but the lack of questioning, the lack of ability to actually affect change, and the lack of welcome I see for that in my children's education really discourages me. And I think that schools should be willing to not just pay lip service to the idea that children should be, taught how to ask interesting, good questions, to interrogate their texts, for instance, but that schools should be the first place they learn that they can make a difference if they have evidence and argument, and if they ask the right questions. And just as a little example, I remember when my son was about 8-9 years old, and he didn't like the fact that his teacher would write up people who hadn't done their reading homework on the board. And in fact, he was getting very upset about it. And I said to him, well, write a letter, and you could even do a petition. So he did this one day, and he wrote his own little petition, and he went around the school classroom before registration and got people to sign it. And the next thing we knew, we were being hauled in to the head teacher's office, who said, and Sam was hauled in as well, and was made very upset by the fact that apparently he had upset the young teacher by the fact that he had got a petition. And I thought, my God, if I'd had a child like that in my class, I would have used this as a way of doing a kind of civics education class to tell you, how useful this can be. But no, the system closed it down. And I think that that's a real failing and could be such an opportunity.
It's a real hobby horse of mine, actually, which is that I think that schools have increasingly become grade factories, and not places where kids are encouraged to do exactly what your son did. And more generally, I saw Lindsay Evans in the chat raising the question of critical thinking, because I think that what happens oftentimes is that things get thrown into a sort of general civics bucket, which is something just they get through, whereas in fact this should be cross-curricular. I don't know if that's your view.
And practical.
Yes. No, exactly. I mean, God, give the boy a gold star.
I didn't.
I
didn't know, really. I didn't properly understand that I could make something change until I was late into my 20s. And I think that's really sad. And I think that children should learn that they can make things change if they understand how to go about it the right way.
That's really, it's kind of a positive thing on which to end, because the fact that he did it is very, very heartening. Alas, we now come to the end of the hour. It's rushed past, which is generally a mark of the quality of the discussion that I think is down to all of you, and I'm very grateful to you for coming. So much I've got pages of notes, but a few things that I wanted to pick out was very interested in Tim's reflections on the way in which the green agenda has shifted in all sorts of different ways, but also that we need to be very mindful in this debate of not jumping onto fads, and that the undoubted fad for mayoralties is not, there are two sides to that coin, and Bristol demonstrates that very well. I think Kerry had so much to teach us about the value of digital voice and public voice more generally, and then how to knit that together with the question of policy formation. And I'm going to go off and read that OECD report, which sounds absolutely intriguing. And thank you very much for steering us to that. And Louise, so interesting. The phrase "democracy starts to unfurl" is going to, I think, haunt me, and it kind of sums up the problem. But also there was so much in what you said that that offers, I think, at least a cautious measure of hope that there are ways of changing it, not least through events like this and journalism of the sort that we try and champion at Tortoise. So do please keep in touch with us on the democracy project. You'll see on the homepage on the website, it has its own section. If you want to get in touch, email me at matt@tortoisemedia.com. Always interested to hear your thoughts at any time. Thanks hugely to Kerry, Tim, and to Louise for their time, and to all of you. Have a cool evening and stay safe in this very odd and strange week. Good evening.